Excellent panel for you. Sitting next to me is Mark J. Thomas. He is a professor of neuroscience and the scientific director of the Medical Discovery Team on Addiction at the University of Minnesota. He's focused on examining how addictive drugs alter the brain and can lead to compulsive drug use. Next in line is Lux Alptrum. She is a writer whose commentary on sex, feminism, and pop culture has been featured in outlets including Cosmopolitan and the New York Times. Her newest book is Faking It: The Lies Women Tell About Sex and the Truths They Reveal. And on the end, we have Dick Scruggs. He's the founder and chairman of Second Chance Mississippi. This is a foundation assisting young adults in achieving work skills and high school equivalency diplomas. He is a native Mississippian and former Navy fighter pilot and a lawyer who gained international fame as the lead lawyer for the states in the historic $250 billion settlement with the tobacco industry. Please welcome the panel. Give them a hand. We'll begin with you, Mark. Please speak to the topic.
Thank you. This is the panel that when I saw the title of the panel, my heart started to beat the fastest of any of the panel titles that I'd seen. And so I've had a few days to think about this and to offer my perspectives as somebody who's a laboratory neuroscientist, somebody who studies rats and mice for a living. And we can't tell when they're lying. So this is a good exercise for me to be part of this. But I'm happy to be here and certainly happy to be here with the other panelists. As I mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm a biologist of the brain. And just to tell you a few words about the kind of work that we do, I got fascinated about the brain and in particular about the brain's capacity to change with experience as an undergraduate in a basic biology course. And in particular, the idea that really grabbed me was the idea that as we learn, as we take place in the Conference on World Affairs or have interesting conversations with people, there are physical, chemical changes that take place in our brain that can last for a lifetime. And to me, that is just a fascinating idea that never gets old, and it's really what fuels the kind of work that I do in the laboratory now. And I'm just so excited to have a group of energetic students around me at the University of Minnesota to work with on these kind of issues. But in particular, I got interested in the idea as I went on and doing my PhD work, the idea that maladaptive stimuli in our environment, like traumatic experiences or chronic exposure to drugs of abuse, could take advantage of the brain's learning mechanisms and change the brain in some maladaptive ways. And that's got some implications for addiction and other mental disorders, things like PTSD, for example, that arise as the result of our experience. And so the way that we've come to think about it as we study these brain changes in the context of addiction models in the lab is that there are some brain changes that happen that make it very difficult for people, or in our case, our laboratory animals, to be susceptible to kind of lifestyle changes. If you can think of a lifestyle change in a mouse or rat, we try to. But in terms of those kinds of experiences, sort of turning somebody around and to putting them on a right path, which is one reason why we think it's so difficult to treat addiction despite our best treatments that we have, which these days are psychosocial type treatments. So where does that come to in terms of this panel? So one thing that I thought of is that there is some interesting evidence and a theory, by no means proven, that changes in the brain take place in at least some people with substance use disorders that inhibit the ability for self-reflection. So that's something that we as humans, we all have that ability, but by no means is that we shouldn't think of that as a fixed ability, that is as a result of brain function. That itself is something that can be changed, and it can be changed for the worse or for the better. And so in terms of why do we lie, I think of it, initially from our work in thinking about addiction. People are in denial about the kinds of problems that they have, and so maybe they're lying to themselves. And so I just want to, I came up with just a few words, that just key words for me that hopefully we'll touch on some of these things as we go. The first one is evolution. As a biologist, I think of, why do we do the things we do? Because evolution sort of drove us to points where we do those things. That's not always the case, but it's a useful lens as a biologist to think about. And we need resources from our environment. And so why do we do what we do? Because it helps us to get those resources for individuals and for the species to evolve. So that in terms of lying, perhaps we lie to survive was one thought that I had. And that's maybe a cynical way to think about it that we can talk about more. We'll probably need a definition of what a lie is, and maybe I can lean on one of my other panelists to get us started on that. If we lie and we're not accountable for that lie, it's going to work to get more resources. So accountability is a piece of this. And maybe I'll save my others for later so we can get on to our next panelist.
Well,
thank you.
Now Lux Alptum.
Hi. So yes, as you heard in my intro, I am the author of Faking It, The Lies Women Tell About Sex and the Truths They Reveal, which is available for sale at Mackie. Please buy it. If you prefer an ebook or an audiobook, those are both available online. The audiobook is read by me, so you can hear these dulcet tones sharing my argument. So just before I start talking about my feelings on lying, I do want to call attention to the fact that I'm the only woman on this panel. And I bring that up not just because I think it's important to have diverse panels, which I do, but because I strongly feel, and through my research have kind of uncovered, that motivations for lying are strongly dependent on our social position and on our identity. So I'll think a lot of times when many of us think of liars, we're going to think about someone like Donald Trump. Someone who, it's true. Someone who is self-aggrandizing, someone who is lying to build themselves up, someone who is lying kind of as a power move, lying because they can. That is definitely one form of lying. I would say that is perhaps a more masculine form of lying, which is, of course, not to say that all men do it, but that's probably more commonly found with men. There are other kinds of lying, too. There's obviously like the social nicety lies, but there are also the lies that I really focus on my book, which are, building off of what Mark said, actually lies that are fundamentally about survival. So I started, when I started writing my book, or before I started writing it, when I first started thinking about the fact that I kept hearing women being accused of being liars, particularly when it came to topics that were loosely related to sex, I initially was like, this is some patriarchal scam. Women are being set up. We are definitely honest. And people are just like, it's just this whole sexism saying that we're liars. And certainly when you look at someone like Hillary Clinton, who was like very, very honest, but got painted as a liar over and over and over again, a lot of that is coming from sexism. But when I started digging into the topics that I explore in my book, which are things like orgasm, things like virginity, things like talking about contraception or sexual pasts, what I found was women often were lying. And they weren't lying out of malice, and they weren't lying to build themselves up. They were often lying out of self-protection. When we look at something like fake orgasm, for instance, many of us have the, I would say, erroneous belief that good sex has to involve an orgasm, that if you're experiencing pleasure, it's necessarily going to result in orgasm, and that is a pleasurable sexual experience. That's not always true for everybody. Some people cannot experience orgasm. Some people don't experience orgasm during partner sex and are fine with that. Sometimes someone's just having a good time and for whatever reason is not having an orgasm. But a lot of times, if you tell your partner, I'm having a good time, but I'm just not going to have an orgasm, they're not going to listen to you. They're going to be offended. They're going to be insulted. They're going to be, they're going to really feel like it's very important for you to have an orgasm or they have failed. So if you're in that situation, faking an orgasm is a really easy way to just get what you want, to end the situation. You've had the pleasure you want. You don't have to have an annoying conversation. That's kind of at the more, and that's at the more lighter end of the spectrum. I think there are other really more disturbing situations that women find themselves in where lying becomes a method of self-protection. We talk about, one of the other lies I talk about is like, I have a boyfriend, so I'm getting hit on or harassed in a bar. If I say, please leave me alone, I don't want to talk to you, I may either not get left alone or I may be putting myself at risk of potentially being assaulted. But if I say I have a boyfriend, I'm now flagging that I'm owned by another man and therefore I get left alone. The most, I think, distressing example, and this is when I say self-protection, I am literally talking about life or death stakes, is when you look at something like virginity. It's not so much in American culture, although we do have a virginity obsession here, but when you look at, for instance, a place like Egypt, where the purity obsession is literally a violent one. You may have someone who is subjected to a quote-unquote virginity test where their genitals are going to be assessed and determined whether or not they comport to what a virgin's genitals look like. Now, virginity is already something of a myth, but specifically the idea that you can look at a person's genitals and determine whether or not they have had sex is extremely a myth. If I am going to be, let's say I've never had sex and I'm going to be subjected to a virginity test, and for whatever reason I know that I don't have the kind of hymen that is expected of someone who's never had sex. If I go now and go to a doctor and get a hymenoplasty that's going to ensure that I pass the virginity test, you could say that I'm lying. I am certainly altering my body to quote unquote cheat at a test, but I'm also altering my body to prove something that's already true, because if I fail, I could be killed. I could be socially ostracized. I could be killed. Like that is an instance of women lying, but lying to fundamentally prove a truth, and lying because we are put in a situation where, again, when we tell our truth, we're either not believed or we're punished because society has created this completely fictional idea of what a woman is and how a woman acts. And I focused primarily on women because that was my specific topic of interest, but I absolutely think that most marginalized groups may find lying to be a social strategy like this, because if you live in a society where the assumption is that your identity is one specific thing and it's one specific thing that it absolutely is not, then sometimes you will have to lie. You'll have to misrepresent yourself so that you can survive, so that you cannot call attention to yourself. I have a lot more to say, I'm sure, but just to keep things rolling, I'll just finish by saying that the conclusion of my book looks at the idea of the false rape charge. And it's not just I personally, like there are studies that show false rape charges are actually very, very rare. And that's obviously every time somebody comes forward and accuses someone of rape, they are accused of lying, but it really doesn't happen that often. And one of the things that I bring up is that all of the lies that I look at, the most common lies that women tell are lies that are, again, about self-protection, about deflecting attention, about going under the radar and not being noticed. And when you lie about sexual assault, it's the exact opposite. You're painting a target on yourself. Or not even when you lie. When you come forward about a sexual assault, you are painting a target on yourself. You are attracting attention to yourself. And that is why it is the least likely time for certainly a woman to lie, because it is so much about making ourselves more safe than about making ourselves less safe.
Hello, everybody, and thanks so much to the conference for having us all here today. This is a great crowd in the late afternoon. I can't imagine why everybody was so interested in why people lie. I mean, look at this. How many of you just thought about that great scene in When Harry Met Sally? When Lux, you may have been a screenwriter for that famous scene between Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan. But anyway, I want somebody to tell me why I'm here on this panel. I'm a trial lawyer, and I cannot imagine why a trial lawyer would be on a panel about lying. I know, I only lie when my lips are moving. Yeah. Anyway, how many of you have read A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin? Team of Rivals, about Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet that he selected for A Team of Rivals. There were two characters in there. One was the Secretary of State, and his name was Seward. Most of you remember who Seward was from your American history, Seward's Folly and that sort of thing. And there was another character in that book called, his name was, he was the Secretary of War, and his name was Stanton. And there's a great line in Gore Vidal's book about Lincoln, which even fewer of you have probably read, that said, Stewart admired the open and honest way in which Seward lied. Said he had the hallmarks of a great lawyer. So I've always thought that was an interesting quote and made you think. How does someone lie openly and honestly? And I'm hoping these panelists who have studied this can elucidate a little bit on how people can lie with such a straight face. I like to think that I was a good lawyer, but it was not because I lied. I think when people lie, particularly lawyers, it becomes fairly obvious. People are at once suspicious when a lawyer starts making an argument that he's trying to do something nefarious. And that he's a hired gun, for one thing. You know, you're paid to spin the facts, but not to mischaracterize the facts or misstate the facts, and you can get in a lot of trouble as a lawyer if you do that, particularly if you do it a lot. But most of the time, you'll lose your case. Either the judge or 2 or 3 members of the jury are not going to buy it, because they can tell that people have good sense. And so, as a lawyer, I never thought lying was something that was a quality that anyone valued in law or otherwise in everyday life. I'd like to hear a little more from the more studious members of the panel, though, on the difference between BS and lying. There seems to be a continuum there. BS, we all do it and laugh about it. Lying, we try not to do it and we condemn it. But I'm not sure I know the difference in other than it's like, I think it was Justice Harlan or someone's famous quote about pornography. You can't define it, but you know it when you see it. So perhaps somebody on the panel can give us a little better definition.
Well, I think so. I would say one of the differences is stakes. So like BS, it's usually kind of low stakes, whereas lying can sometimes, especially the lying that gets condemned, is often a little bit more higher stakes. I think also BS is seen as something where it's victimless. It's like, oh, I'm going to like puff up like my resume. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make myself sound more important, but it kind of doesn't really matter. Or I'm going to go into a job interview and be like, yes, absolutely, I've done that before, and I am an expert in Excel. I know all about that. Whereas like lying, I think, is assumed to be harmful and assumed to be with an intent to cause harm.
That's a good point. One of the things that I thought about in terms of when I was trying to come up with a definition of what a lie is, and again, maybe it's something we all know it when we see it, but there's some measure of certainty that you as an individual have about something, and you're making a claim that does not agree with the certainty that you feel about that, right? And which Does that ring true to any? I mean, does that?
Yeah. Well, I also want to say I tend to define lying broadly.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole chapter in my book on beauty culture and makeup. And then sometimes, I bring that up and there will be women who will be like, makeup's not lying. And I'm like, well, I don't think it is. And I all of these like lies I defend, but you can't deny the fact that there are men there's a whole culture of men on the internet who will do things like post a picture of a woman without makeup and a woman with a full face of makeup and be like, see, these women are trying to trick us. Like, they're wearing makeup, so like a 3 is trying to make you think she's a 7, but blah, 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 blah. And so they are perceiving it as a lie. They are perceiving it as trickery. And when they are angry at women, it is one of these things where, yeah, for me, I'm like, I'm wearing makeup right now. I'm wearing lipstick. I'm wearing blue eyeliner. I don't think you actually think that there's a blue line on my eyelids naturally, but to some people, the fact that I do this is a form of deception.
So is there a distinction between lying and deception? Or, I guess that's where the BS versus lying comes in, right?
Yeah. It is very much in the eye of the beholder. Like, there are things I actually really don't like me. I know I have this whole book that's defending lying, but I find dishonesty really upsetting, in part because I have been close to serial liars, and it's very upsetting when you exist in that. But I would say, I think, like, it's hard to say what is a lie. There's not super concrete stuff. Like, I will be very upset when I think that someone close to me has been dishonest with me, but sometimes that means, like, I had a past partner who got a goldfish and had won it at a bar, but for some reason didn't want me to know he went to the bar, and then like said he bought it, and then it came out, and it was like such a mundane thing, but it was very upsetting to me because I was like, why would you like lie about that like really, really simple thing? And like, that is like fundamentally like, who cares where this goldfish came from? It was a white lie, whatever. But I think the impact, depending on the person you're talking to, depending on their worldview, depending on their own relationship to honesty and trust, it can feel really destructive.
Lux, do people believe their own lies? I mean, sometimes I think Donald Trump believes his own lies. That's one of the, and he's not the only person. I'm picking on him, but.
Oh, he's so easy to pick on.
That's low-hanging fruit, all right. But it seems that there are some people that seem to believe it. I mean, they lie openly and honestly, as the quote indicated, as if they believe it, or that is true, Mark. That some people do that.
No,
actually believe it, or Lux?
Some people definitely believe their own lies. I think sometimes that goes into mental health issues, particularly. No, but also, like, people who are pathological about lying, like, you can be a very good liar because you convince yourself it's true. And there are people who I think definitely don't fully just really buy into their own story, really buy into their own stuff. And I've, like, certainly met people like this. But those people sometimes don't even realize they're lying because they're just so into whatever it is that they are telling the world. But I think most of us know when we're lying. It's not a question of whether or not we know it's a lie. It's a question of whether or not we feel that it's justified. And again, like, to go back to my original point, like, what your position is in society will change what you think is an acceptable motivation for lying. Like, if you are a privileged person who believes that the world is yours for the taking, then doing anything that gets you what you want, even lying, is going to feel justified because you deserve whatever you want. So it doesn't matter if you had to lie to get that upgrade, if you had to lie to get that job, if you had to lie because it was supposed to be yours. But I think if you are, not coming from a position of power, you're probably not going to tell that kind of lie. You're probably not going to make yourself bigger with a lie. You are going to lie to make yourself smaller and lie to avoid people and lie to not to stay out of trouble, but like not in a you're doing something wrong way. Stay out of trouble as in somebody's trying to punish you. Yeah.
So just to pick up on that a little bit and take it in a slightly different direction, I mentioned the word accountability earlier, and that was it's when I think about gather, with my biologist hat on, gathering resources to try to survive in a difficult environment. If animals don't lie in a way that we can figure out, but with that as our evolutionary background, if we were to lie to gather more resources, and we weren't held accountable for it, it's a pretty good strategy then, and so, I'm a little concerned, this is stepping outside my realm of expertise, but it seems to me that we aren't holding people accountable in a way that maybe we used to hold them accountable, our public figures, for whether or not it's misstatements or whether or not it's outright lies. And so it becomes a viable strategy, if not to, in this case, gather resources specifically per se, but to set the tone for a political argument, and so why do we lie? One answer is because it works, I guess,
Yeah,
which is pretty...
If
I don't want to stop the panel with that.
No.
Let's keep going to get more optimistic.
Yeah,
there.
well, I don't know if this is going to be optimistic, but certainly if you are in a position of enough power, as we're seeing right now, you may not be held accountable, or people will just sort of like brush off your lies and be like, whatever, we all know you're lying, who cares? Which is very disturbing situation to be in. I agree. I want to actually talk a little bit. So I said that most rape charges are true. It's very rare that there are false rape charges, but I do want to just touch actually on why there are, when there are, because I think it's really interesting. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot in the past few months, as there was, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this news story, but there was the news story about Jussie Smollett, who reported a hate crime, and then it was said that he had lied, and then the charges were dropped. And I don't actually know whether or not he lied, and that's not really the point to litigate whether or not this guy did. But I think with something like a hate crime or a sexual assault, there's two things that there are two dynamics, and they tend to, again, one is kind of associated with people coming from privilege, and one is associated with people who are coming from a position of marginalization. So the one that we always think about when somebody falsely reports a crime, we assume that they are falsely reporting a crime to get back at someone else, to punish someone else, to create some kind of harm. I mean, the one that really comes to mind, this is probably like 11 years ago, during one of the Obama elections, there was some girl who claimed that Obama supporters had beaten her up and carved a bee on her face. It was very weird. And it was not true, but this was a white woman who was conservative, I think came from a privileged background, who was kind of trying to take down other people. Or you see the Acorn stuff, that James O'Keefe guy, he's always trying to lie and do this stuff because he's trying to take down other people, and it's very much this kind of revenge lying. And I think a lot of us assume, and certainly when women come forward about former partners who have assaulted them or who were abusive, you always hear oh, she's just trying to get revenge, she's just trying to do this. And absolutely there are some people who do that, but I think a lot of this revenge lying happens when you are already in a position of power. But what happens more when you are reporting a false rape, a lot of times people who are doing that, or a false hate crime, they're actually not coming from a position of power. They're not necessarily they're not even necessarily naming a specific person. They might just be saying oh yeah, I was assaulted. And sometimes it's to get out of trouble. Teenagers will potentially report assault because they're not supposed to be having sex. With adults, it's, sometimes it's you were arrested and you can kind of get out of the arrest if you claim to have been sexually assaulted or something like this. You're maybe trying to evade something, you're trying to do this, but oftentimes you are someone who has probably experienced some kind of trauma. You have experienced a lot of hurt, and even if you were not specifically assaulted, claiming to have been sexually assaulted is a way of communicating a hurt that cannot be otherwise communicated, which is a line, I forget how she says it verbatim, but a friend of mine, the artist Elisa Schwartz, who's researched false false rape claims for a art project that she did. She talks about like what is the hurt that's being communicated in the false rape claim that cannot otherwise be communicated. Like maybe I wasn't sexually assaulted right now, but I was assaulted by someone else a different time. Or maybe I'm just constantly experiencing gendered violence and gendered harm that doesn't come up to the level of a sexual assault that someone will be arrested for. But if I say I was raped, I will be taken seriously and I will get not attention. Attention is the wrong word, but I will get the compassion and the caring that has been denied for me. And I think, again, I don't encourage anybody to report a false rape, but I think that when someone has been when somebody has falsely accused someone else, or not even a specific person, but falsely reported some kind of attack or some kind of assault, sexual or otherwise, it is really worthwhile to say, what are they trying to communicate? Are they trying to get revenge on someone? Or are they actually just saying, I am hurt and I need help and I don't know how else to express this hurt?
Are there situations, Lux, that where people are more inclined to lie than others? In the sexual realm you discussed, I mean, what other situations are people inclined to lie?
I mean, you know, it depends on the individual, absolutely. But I certainly think people are inclined to lie when telling the truth will put them in harm's way. I mean, we all understand that. I mean, on a very low stakes level, if I ask you how I look and you don't think I look that great, but you know I'm going to be really angry if you say that, you'll be like, oh, you look great. Like, I mean, it's a very low stakes lie, but that's one where, you know, you want to avoid negative consequences. But what those negative consequences are, it just really depends on the circumstances. Do we get any audience questions?
We do have, this feeds into one to Mr. Scruggs. If you would please comment on lying in terms of the tobacco industry.
Oh. You know, the big lie the tobacco industry got away with the big lie for a long time. First of all, they denied the carcinogenic effects of tobacco smoke, claiming it wasn't proven. Went out of their way to do tests on tobacco with animals, none of which were calculated to determine whether the animals would get sick from tobacco smoke, but they were deceptive in the sense that they looked like science. It's a strange psychology with tobacco, particularly the individual lawsuits against the tobacco industry. And I tried two before we started representing the states and raised the stakes on the tobacco industry, and it resulted in the big settlement 20 years ago. But it was a strange dynamic with jurors in that, and they all believed that smoking caused cancer, and they all believed that the tobacco industry was lying about it. But they were hesitant, reluctant, loath even, to reward the smoker. It was, people just don't have a lot of sympathy, at least didn't then, with an addict. And so the argument we made that he was addicted to the nicotine, and that's why he smoked, that it wasn't a free choice to smoke, like the Marlboro Man, and the other implications and just steadfast lies that the tobacco industry told to avoid regulation and avoid litigation, it just didn't resonate. And I think people, jurors particularly, thought, well, yeah, there's a warning on the cigarette package, but the government makes them put that on. They don't necessarily buy that. They would come up with all sorts of constructs not to award damages to someone who had gotten lung cancer or died from another smoking-related illness. Now, we exposed an awful lot of that. We were really fortunate in some whistleblowers that came forward who were high company executives. If any of you saw the movie The Insider, it was nominated for a number of Academy Awards back in 2001, I think. It really, I recommend that movie to you if you hadn't seen it. with Al Pacino, Russell Crowe, had a great cast in it. But it went through how the industry constructed. They did a tremendous amount of research on public attitudes, focus group after focus group. You'd think they were a political organization as much as they did opinion and marketing research on human psyche and what would sell and what would attract, particularly kids, because most people smoked. 80-90% of the people who smoked in those days started as teenagers, 15, 16-year-olds, underage. And there were reasons why some of the big tobacco companies bought food companies and sold cereal, because they could do marketing research on cereal to see what characters. That's kind of where Joe Camel came from, if you remember that. I see a lot of you in here old enough to remember all that stuff. But I've gone far afield of that question, but there was a tremendous amount of lying, but most people knew they were lying, and that's the hard thing to come to grips with, is how they could have avoided disastrous litigation as long as they did when they were so obviously lying. And I don't have a good answer for that.
Can I ask a follow-up to that one, to you, Dick? The question is, did the accountability that we held them to, that you were able to hold them to, was that the kind of thing that would prevent something like that happening in the future? That's maybe a loaded question, because we're maybe in the midst of it now.
I don't think so. I really don't.
Not that we blame you for that. You did your
No,
work.
Well, in terms of the tobacco industry, they made a big deal of coming clean and fessing up to all their sins, and then kind of went right back at it through the back door. I mean, with all the vaping and all that stuff. But it was progress. It wasn't the nicotine per se that was killing people. That was what made them smoke. But it was more the carcinogens in the smoke itself, not the nicotine, that kill people. And at least they're not smoking like they used to. When we launched that lawsuit in 1993 for the states, adult smoking was about 28% in the U.S., from a high of about 60% back in the 60s. It was still 28%. Now it's down about 15%, and it's dropped way off for kids. It's been marginalized as a, yeah, right on. And that was the goal in holding them accountable. So we've made progress there, but you see this stuff pop up with Purdue Pharma, with opioids. It's that sort of deceptive advertising and marketing is not going to go away. It's just going to shift over to a different substance or industry.
The question to Mark, maybe you can take this one, is we talked about the difference between BS and lies and thinking of them on a scale. If people repeatedly engage in the kind of low-level lying, thinking it's not a big deal, it doesn't have consequences, can that become addictive? Can it lead and escalate to the big lies?
Boy, that's an interesting question, hard one to answer, but I'll do my best. We do see that repeated everyday behaviors that can become habits. They alter neural pathways in ways that sort of make it easier to do that habitual thing. And so it makes some sense with that perspective to me, that that escalating the deceptive or lying behavior, it would be easier to do. Sorry, it's not a deeper answer, but that's what I can offer.
Mm-hmm. So I'm also thinking of when I was assigned to this panel, I thought of there's the Seinfeld episode where George Costanza says it's not a lie if you believe it, and also there's a Simpsons episode. I think Homer Simpson says, it takes two to lie, one to lie, and one to listen. I don't have time to explain, but we've had quite a few questions from the audience about the recipient of the lie, and if you could talk about that, and what is the role of the one listening to the lie? And this question says specifically the concept of individuals who, in quotes, want to be lied to.
Well, I mean, in our society, I would argue, like going back to some of the lies that I talk about in my book and lies about women, a lot of men do want to be lied to. And not even just men, but people who are talking to women often do want to be lied to. I mean, going back to the orgasm example, yeah, theoretically, we all want our partners to enjoy sex. We all want our partners to have authentic orgasms. But a lot of people, if your ego is fragile enough, you kind of do want to be lied to because you don't actually want to have this conversation about how, orgasm isn't, sex doesn't have to look the way that you think it does. Orgasm is not always necessary. Sex can be more complicated. It can be this, it can be that. Sometimes you just want to be able to live in your fantasy of like, oh, it just looks this way and we're going to do it this way and this is going to work great and I'm going to get what I want and like I'm not going to have to really think about the broader thing. I think... trying to think of other examples. I mean, certainly, the I have a boyfriend lie, I think that's a case of men wanting their egos protected to a certain extent, not wanting to have to understand or think about the fact that maybe a woman just does not want to talk to you. Maybe a woman wants to be left alone. Maybe it's not even about you. I think that's also like very hard for a lot of men to comprehend, that women have lives that have nothing to do with men. And yeah, I mean, certainly, I think when people want to be lied to, in that case, it is often about wanting to buy into a simplistic narrative of how things are rather than confront the complexity of how they actually are. And that comes up a lot in things related to sex, because a lot of us don't want to talk about sex or really want sex to be easy and don't want to confront the fact that it's a very diverse human experience, that all of us have bodies that are different. There is no one thing I can tell you to do that's going to make you have an amazing sex life aside from learn what your body is like and talk to your partners. But I think that like being lied to and being told that the world is simpler and that it's easier that can be very attractive for some people. But it often can cause a lot of harm.
And thinking about the harm part of it and coming back to accountability again, hate to keep mentioning this, but it seems important to me that you hate to put the onus on the person who's being lied to, but in order for the lies not to work, there has to be that accountability. And so I think that, in order for, right?
Well, I will say, people ask me like, oh, about my book, like, what do you think women should do? Like, are you saying women should stop lying? And I actually do put the onus on, I guess, people who are being lied to, men, but also broader society, because I'm like, but if women are lying because nobody's listening to our truth, if women are lying because when we tell the truth we're punished, then yeah, the onus is on the people who are being lied to, because you have to create a society where women can be honest, where women can express our truth, can talk about the fact that we are not all one person, that we have many different experiences, that our lives look differently, that we feel differently about different things, that our bodies don't comport to one single standard. You have to create a world where that's okay if you want women to stop lying. I mean, on the flip side, as someone who, as I said, I was very close to a serial liar, that was an abusive relationship, and in that case, it's harder for me to be like, oh, if you're a victim of abuse, it's on you. Because oftentimes you are fundamentally disempowered. And it's very hard. If you have an abusive partner who keeps lying to you and you can't leave because it's an abusive relationship, it's very hard to be like, well, you need to stand up. And like, yeah, eventually the way you get out is by finding support and finding yourself and leaving. But again, a lot of this stuff comes back to power dynamics, and lies told by powerful people are fundamentally different from lies told by disempowered people.
Where do you put the concealment on that scale? I mean, where you don't overtly tell a falsehood. You just remain silent when you should speak up.
Well, I mean, it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about like something relatively minor, I don't think it's that big a deal. If we're talking about that someone didn't murder someone.
Well, sexual
and you-
relationships, for example.
Yeah.
If you have an affair with someone, you don't. You're not questioned about it. You don't lie about it. You just don't talk about it.
I mean, I think it depends. So Dan Savage, the sex advice columnist, is very, last I checked, he may have changed his opinion on this, but last I checked, he was very like, if you have an affair, it is on you to keep that secret to your death, because why would you destroy the other person's happy relationship? If you know that you want to be in that relationship, especially if you know it was a one-time thing, like, why would you bring this into the relationship? Your punishment is living with this. I think there's an argument to be made for that. But it's also, it does come to like, are you a habitual cheater? Because then that's a different thing. If you are doing something that you know is harmful and you know is causing someone, especially someone you claim to love, harm, and you're repeatedly doing it, I think that is a big problem. And I think that like concealment is a very, very big problem. But again, like so much of this stuff, it depends on the power balance between people. It depends on the impact. It depends on the intent. And it's not, I think, just
I
omitting
think
something.
intent's really important. I don't want
Yeah.
to hog this conversation, but I think intent's very important.
Yeah.
Everybody here knows someone who's very candid all the time. They'll just give them the unvarnished truth, whether you like it or not. But you appreciate that because that person is that way. And they're not intending to hurt your feelings or cause harm. They're just straight up people. So their intent is benign. But there are others who will tell you a lie or will say something to you or conceal something, deceive you, that they either trying to protect themselves or they're trying to inflict damage on you, hurt you. But I don't think. I think if you are consistently candid, that I think you're better off than someone who tells a lot of white lies all the time. If you say, "How do I look today?" and they say, "Well, great." I mean, you're not going to believe that after a while because there are days when you won't. So anyway, that's a point about nothing, I guess. But I've got a real close friend who's a Rhodes Scholar, and I asked him about the interview process and that the Rhodes Committee put him through. That's a big important part of that selection. He was just out of college, and he said, "Well, they ask you a lot of questions about things you don't know much about." I said, "Well, how do you deal with that?" He said, "Well, they're really watching to see if you can segue over to something seamlessly that you do know something about." Right? So I'm not doing a very seamless job of segueing off the topic.
A question for Mark. If you want to, could you talk about brain change and lying in people with substance abuse disorders, and are there any possible developments in ways to mitigate that or support them?
Yeah, so I mentioned that. It's an interesting question. I mentioned a little bit in my introduction, and it's an emerging hypothesis in the field. We know that there are brain changes that take place in some people with chronic drug use that in particular change portions of the prefrontal cortex, which is highly developed in people as compared to other organisms, and is an important part of the brain that takes care of what we call executive function or planning and that sort of thing. And that is, we think, the part of the brain that is in charge of things like self-reflection. and confabulation, which I'll get to in a second. But so we know that part of the brain is affected by drugs and people who tend to have problems with their usage. And we know that part of the brain is involved in this self-reflection and perhaps lying to oneself. And so there's this emerging theory that they're related in some way, but we don't really have the hard data to say that that's the case. And so some of the newest addiction treatments that are being considered and to some degree have started to come into play involve neural stimulation. So rather than providing some kind of new drug, wonder drug that's going to remove cravings for people, it's actually to use our brain knowledge or knowledge about the brain to actually try to, in a safe way, rewire parts of the prefrontal cortex in ways that can disrupt drug cravings and might be able to reduce some of these other problems that come with prefrontal damage.
Excellent. And this is a question, a couple of questions have come in from Mr. Scruggs. You talk about a prison sentence in your bio, and this question is, did a lie from you contribute to your prison sentence?
I'm sorry, the question again?
Did a lie from you contribute to your prison sentence?
No, I went to prison for a bribery attempt. It wasn't a lie. I had good enough legal advice not to lie to the authorities. That's a crime these days. No, I don't make any alibis or excuses. There's another side of the story, but I pled guilty and did my time, and so got a good life going now. Got a great foundation going, and been home for 6 years. But it wasn't a lie that got me in trouble.
All right. We have a question. What about institutional lying? An example, the Catholic Church.
Is that for me?
Well,
I'm
I
a
think for all of
Presbyterian,
the
guys.
panelists, because we've been talking.
Do we have any Catholics? I actually.
I am.
You are. My uncle is a former Catholic priest. He's married now, which is part of why he left the priesthood. I think, again, institutions have power. And I'm not sure what specific lies were being referenced. My mind, when we talk about lying in the Catholic Church, is the covering up of the abuse of children for a very long period of time. And when we look at, if we're going to call that a lie, which I think that falls under the rubric of lying, that is, again, an instance of, it's an instance of a powerful institution trying to stay in power. And it's an act of, quote-unquote, self-protection, but it is a self-protection that is causing great harm to people. And I think that institutions often engage in this kind of lying, where if you want to stay in power, if you are in power and you want to stay in power, you will do whatever you can to change the story so that it is favorable to you. Why are we on the path to climate change? Because our institutions knew about climate change decades ago, but decided to lie about it, decided to spread false information because they understood that if they were very open, and when I mean they, I really mean the oil companies. They knew that if they were open about the harm that they knew they were doing to the planet, that they would lose, a couple $2 billion that they didn't want to lose. So I find that really, I don't think it's hard to understand why that happens. If you have power, you want to remain in power. I think that is probably the least justifiable, though.
Can I use that to segue to something?
Yeah.
Do you mind? So there's a kind of lying that I find inexplicable, and that is in my own field. There are scientists who fabricate data, and I always find that to be just amazing because we're in the business of trying to find the truth, and if you publish something that is not accurate and well supported, you are going to get found out, and it's going to drag. You're held accountable. I would like to think in our world of scientific research, and that one is always really hard for me. And so that, in some ways, really it deepens my thinking about lying, but I'm not sure where it takes me. I'm wondering whether anybody can help me with that.
It's funny that you bring that up. Both my parents are scientists, and my mother, I believe when she was doing her grad degree, one of the other people in her lab was falsifying data. They were taking, I forget what it's called, but just something that you do to like look at DNA. It's like these clear white sheets with like black bars on them. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but basically you'll do this. You'll like change stuff, and then the image is going to change if you get certain results. And this woman was just like cutting out the black bars that she didn't want to be there and manufacturing a new one. And and like saying like, look, they disappeared. Like I got the results that I want. And eventually she was found out. I mean, I think that, and of course, when you get found out, it destroys your career. I think people who do that don't think they're going to get found out. And I don't know if we can literally call it an addiction, but definitely, like certain people, if you falsify data, then you kind of have to keep falsifying data, or you tell yourself, I'm going to falsify data. Like, let's look at like Elizabeth Holmes, for instance, who was Theranos, who there's been all these documentaries. Like, they kept lying about the results. They kept lying and saying, oh yeah, we're getting these amazing results for these blood tests off of a single drop of blood out of this little box, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually it was found out that everything, the whole technology was a fraud. There was no validity there. And this was this question I had where I was like, did she just think she was going to keep running this shell game forever? And it seems like she thought she was eventually going to have a breakthrough and make this work, and that she was just trying to keep it going, keep the money coming in, keep the things, to keep everybody dancing until she actually reached it, which I sure is some people thinking like, oh, I'm falsifying data because eventually I'm going to get there, and this is just like a rough patch I'm getting over. But most of the time, no, you falsify data, you have to continue to falsify data, and then you get found out. So just a theory.
One question, what about lying in public office? And should people be held to a higher standard if they have that public responsibility? And maybe we could double up with this question as well, which is some have commented on obvious and known liars and is it more difficult to challenge them like Trump or the tobacco industry? Or do they just get by with it because they do it so often and it's accepted?
I feel like that's for you.
For me?
Yeah, I feel like you might have the best knowledge for that one.
Like in the tobacco industry, as I said a minute ago, that people didn't believe them. People believed back even decades ago that smoking caused cancer, even though the tobacco industry denied it. And the tobacco industry knew that people knew they were lying about it, but they continued to do it because fessing up to the truth would have meant that they were going to be regulated or put out of business or both. But they knew their audience knew they were lying. So they had, for whatever reason, psychologically, that worked for them for a long, long time. One of the things, we're talking about the scientific literature, often litigation I was involved in almost every time in later years involved a sort of a battle of expert witnesses, and leading scientists in different fields would testify against each other, so to speak, even though they were there as a scientific expert, supposedly not for or against one side or the other, which was really a joke. Everybody knew you wouldn't put a witness on as a lawyer; it'd be malpractice unless the testimony were going to benefit your side of the case. So I guess that was a lie, to try to represent somebody as a fair and honest expert witness when you call them to the witness stand. There are some, but typically that's not the case. But what I ran into often, more often than fraudulent data, was failure to disclose industry ties, so that from the outset, some of the research was calculated to come up with only one result. Tobacco industry was great at this. So were some other industries too. Some of the companies that manufactured stimulants like Ritalin were doing the same thing. They had this cadre of scientists who they relied on, paid a lot of money to come up with favorable results, and not to do any tests that might turn out to be unfavorable. So there's a lot of deception going on that isn't just outright fraudulent, where they're not falsifying data. They're just discontinuing data if it looks like it isn't going to come out right. They just discontinue the study.
So also to go to the first question, I would say, yeah, absolutely politicians should be held to a higher standard because politicians' lies affect all of us. I think when you look at something like Trump, most of us know that Trump is lying. Like I think what's very interesting to me about that situation, especially when people are trying to end of truth, most people don't believe Trump. There are absolutely some QAnon types and some of his most loyal followers who absolutely believe everything that he says. But the people who work in the White House know he's lying. The people on the media know he's lying. Most of us know he's lying. It's just that it's not seen as worth it to there's stories that come out of the White House where it's oh yeah, we all know he's lying, whatever. They just don't see it as worth it to push back on him because he's not really a leader. He's just sort of a giant child who happens to be residing in the White House that everybody is working around. But I think there is a difference between lying and being believed, and there is this fear that people have oh, Trump is lying, Trump is lying, Trump is lying, end of truth. And I'm no, it's more that Trump is just being allowed to do whatever he wants and there's no accountability. It's not that we suddenly think the sky is green because he says that. Most of us know, and sometimes as someone who works in the media, it's actually kind of frustrating to see these stories oh my God, and then he lied again, because at this point it's well, we know he's lying. You should absolutely very clearly constantly talk about how he's lying, but it's almost not a news story. I mean, if it's a news story every day, really, because I think he's almost incapable of telling the truth.
So when do you think someone is most likely to accept a lie, and what makes people most susceptible to believing them?
When it comports to your worldview. Why do people... The people, going back to Trump, why do people believe Trump? Because they are racist people who want to believe that Mexicans are dangerous, who want to believe that Chicago is a hellhole, who want to believe the things that he says. Or not necessarily racist, but whatever lie he says, if it fits with the view of your world that you want to exist, of course you're going to believe it. And that's also not just Trump followers. I'm sure I'm susceptible to lies that sound like things that I want to hear. You've seen it all the time, and you see who you're more willing to believe is being misrepresented in the media. It very often is just, what kind of world do you want to believe you live in?
And so we had a couple questions about evolution in animals, and would you consider animals camouflaging themselves a form of deception and lying, and how does that maybe fit into your opening comments?
I said I was the biologist, so maybe I have to take a crack at this one. Yeah, I think we talked about lying as you have to have some self-knowledge in order to, and it's sort of unclear to the extent to which at least some animals, those that can camouflage themselves, have that self-knowledge. So I don't know that I would call it lying. But I think that's the taking advantage of your whatever you can in your situation to get resources. I mean, I do think that's where lying comes from. It seems kind of hard to deny that part. So I mean, this sort of thing developed into the world that we now have, where we lie, because of the brains that we have and we have self-reflection. We
I mean,
can
and
lie.
you could argue that makeup or some applications of makeup are a form of camouflage. Like, there are studies that show that women who wear makeup to work make more money. And that's not like wearing like full evening face. That's usually you are camouflaging your skin. You are making it look that your skin is flawless. You are making your eyes look brighter. You are hiding dark circles under your eyes. And you are making your face look like the youthful, well-rested face that we expect of women. Again, like I think, whether or not you consider that a lie is your perspective, but that's a form of camouflage that people call lies. Yeah.
And this is to Mr. Scruggs, but I'll open it up to the whole panel. It says, what is the most creative and successful, at least until discovered, lie told by a politician in your lifetime?
Wow. By a politician.
I'd ask you just to for anyone, if you have one that's just a good story to tell, let us know.
Well, again, we hold politicians to a lower standard, I think, in general. But there's some you want to believe, like Luck said, that because they fit into your worldview and support your worldview, and those on the other side you think they're lying. I can't recall the biggest lie of all. I mean. Bill Clinton's the one that comes to mind there, and I supported Bill Clinton. But sure, that was definitely a lie, and probably the most notorious of our lifetime by a man in high office. And all the reasons that were discussed here came into play there. I mean, he was trying to protect himself, and he probably, to be generous, didn't want to hurt his wife. He thought it was one of these things he thought he could get away with, and I don't think she believed him. I mean, it wasn't his first rodeo, but that's probably the most notorious, to give you a quick answer.
I mean, I'd say the most successful, I don't want to celebrate it, but the denial of climate change has been very successful.
I don't know if it has or not. I think people know it's changing. They just don't want to do
but,
anything about it.
Right. But it's delayed action long
Yeah.
enough, I would say.
It's not acute.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's going to wrap up the panel for today. Let's give an applause to all the panelists. Mark Thomas,
Thank
Lux Altcom, and Dick Scruggs. And thank you all for coming out.
Good job.
Thank
Good job.
you. It was
Good
so
job.
great. Thank you so much.